We're joined by the best-selling author of Confessions of an Economic Hitman, as well as one of his latest books, Hoodwinked, John Perkins. John, great to have you back.
Good to be with you, Alex, again. Thank you.
I've been interviewing you, 5, 6 years since your first book came out, and you predicted much of what has now unfolded. We're seeing the very same private banking cartels telling the European Union now, transfer all of your existing rights and sovereignty to a new private financial order. And I see Bloomberg News admitting, yes, national sovereignty and democracy in Germany is the problem. We need bankers ruling everything, or we're going to have a global economic implosion. Is this by design, or does it even matter? Because at the end of the day, we are seeing a global banking dictatorship set up.
Well, I don't think there's any question, Alex, that it's by design. The people at the top, what I call the corporatocracy, the people who run our biggest corporations around the world, they know what they're doing. They know what's going on here, and they want it to happen this way. It's by design. They're taking control. You know, we've moved from a time a few hundred years ago when religious organizations pretty much ran the world, to then governments running the world, and now we've moved to the next phase, which is the big corporations controlling the world financially and economically and politically. Nations don't mean much anymore. The corporations are really exercising their muscle right now.
They certainly are. Talk about some of the big power players from your perspective. And for viewers who may not know who you are, tell us a little bit about your experience that's unique to be able to make the assessment you've made today.
Well, my official title was Chief Economist at a major consulting firm in Boston, Massachusetts. This is back in the 70s. I was really an economic hitman. I arranged huge loans for countries that had resources that corporations coveted, from places like the World Bank and the private banking industry. Money never actually went to those countries. It went instead to our own corporations to build big infrastructure projects in those countries, like power plants and industrial parks, that benefited a few wealthy people in those countries, as well as our own corporations, but didn't help the majority of the people. Too poor to buy electricity, couldn't get jobs in industrial parks because they don't hire many people. And yet they, the people of the country, were left holding a huge debt they couldn't repay. So we go back at some point and say, hey, since you can't pay your debts, sell your oil to our oil companies real cheap, or your mineral resources, whatever. Open your markets to us. Let us build a military base on your soil. Vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote. And in the few cases where these leaders didn't go along with what we wanted them to, what we call the jackals went in. These are people that assassinate or overthrow governments. And because I couldn't bring Jaime Roldos, president of Ecuador, around, or Omar Torrijos of Panama, they were both assassinated in this process. It's a pretty insidious method, but it's a new way of forming empire. And it's turned out to be extremely successful, and it's bringing us all apart.
Well, if one thing is clear, Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, the other big mega global banks are totally ruthless and really revel in oppression and destroying societies. And as you pointed out, they go in and build their own infrastructure that's taxpayer paid for. So the public pays for the services, but also pays for the investment. And then the country goes into impossible to pay off debts. I've seen numbers of Nigeria. They get $1 billion loan over the last 30 years, pay over $50 billion, and still owe tens of billions of dollars. And now this very structure is being used on the West, breaking down what we're seeing happen in Europe and here in the U.S. What is the end game of these big mega banks and corporations that have grown up around them?
It's total control. It's a new form of empire. It's an empire that isn't created primarily through the military, although the military is right there always to back up these corporations if they get into trouble. But it's this form of empire that's being built around debt and fear. And in a way, it dates back to the old feudal empires, where you had these castles around the countryside, and you had a few what we call the bourgeoisie, people that lived around the outsides of the castles. And they were kept there. They kept us having to give a huge percentage of their crops or whatever they did, blacksmiths, whatever their work they did, they had to donate it to the lord of the castle and his knights. Or they felt that they would be attacked by somebody from another castle. We're very much in that mentality today, except today the castle is the big corporations, and the lords are the CEOs of those corporations, and their knights are all the henchmen that work for them. Very, very similar situation. And yes, we're seeing it in the United States. We're seeing it in Europe. I'm on my way to Istanbul to speak at a major conference there of of leaders from many Eastern European and Middle Eastern countries. They're experiencing it big time. And people are beginning to understand what's happening. That's why we're having these uprisings, what we call the Arab Spring, and many other parts of the world. We're seeing people begin to really get informed and demonstrate against this.
Zbigniew Brzezinski told the Council on Foreign Relations last year that for the first time in history, quote, all of humanity is awake and staring at the elite, not at their puppet frontmen, and that the elite had a big problem. How do you see the kleptocrats, the corporate fascists, whatever you want to call them, how do you see them trying to maintain and expand this control? Because I see their undoing being they're so good at wrecking societies and knocking out their competition and destroying economic diversity. They're such an incredible corporate Borg that in the final equation, they must be overthrown. I mean, it's almost built in that it's an overreach.
Yes, and, well, you know, what we're seeing now is a classic battle, really a war between those in control, the guys who run the castle, and those who used to sit outside the castle quietly serving those in the castle. And now, kind of like the Robin Hood coming along, finally saying, this isn't fair, this isn't going to work anymore. And so at that point, the people in the castle, the corporatocracy, the people who are running our big corporations, really dig in harder and harder. And let's face it, today they own the U.S. Congress and basically every other political leader in the world in any so-called democracy. Nobody gets elected to president of the United States or Congress without the financial support from these corporations. It used to be that our elected officials in the United States wrote the laws. Today, it's the corporations, it's their lobbyists. They pass them through the elected officials whom they own. And yet, we're really seeing it. And I think when Obama got elected, and there was a great hope amongst the people on the left, or the liberals, or progressives, whatever you want to call it, but they've come to see that this liberal Democrat, in many respects, is not very different from a conservative Republican. We're all really beginning to get it now. And as we get it, we're going to expect the status quo to dig in even more strongly. And that's exactly what's happening today. You're having the people rising up. In many places, Washington, D.C. now, Wall Street, in addition to the Middle East and the Far East and Latin America and Africa. And at the same time, the status quo, those in control, the corporatocracy, are going to dig in harder and harder and harder.
We're talking to John Perkins, best-selling author, New York Times, #1 best-selling author, economic hitman, and of course he also put out Hoodwinked. I had read, coming up in a few months, it's coming out in paperback, invaluable reading. You know, I do radio interviews as you do and TV interviews all over the world. And so many times they bring up John Perkins. They say, wow, what you're talking about, have you heard of John Perkins? I'm like, of course I have. And correct me if I'm wrong, but you are an admitted, self-described former knight of these guys, a former henchman, or I guess you could say almost a financial and political cutthroat of Prince John. But now you've kind of joined Robin Hood and the Merry Men from being on the inside and going to the Pentagon and having meetings and getting the walking orders and all of that. Now being here today, knowing the mindset of the plutocrats, when you say they're going to dig in, how do you expect them to dig in as somebody who formerly served Darth Sidious?
Well, you hit the nail on the head there, Alex. Yes, I did do all those things. And incidentally, the system is so insidious that when I did it, I came out of business school. I thought I was doing the right thing because business schools, in essence, teach us if we want to be good economists, if we want to be good managers, we need to be the knights that serve these Darth Vaders, as you put it. And that's what we're taught. And so for a long time, I bought into that because I'd been taught that was the right thing to do. But the deeper I got into the system, the more I could see how terrible and insidious it is, and anti-democratic and anti-everything we in the United States believe that we believe in, that I thought that I believed in. So at this point in time, what they're doing is getting everybody into debt. as much as they can. You know, right now Greece is the top one in the news, but before that it was Ireland and then Iceland and so on, and of course individuals in the United States. And when you get people into this kind of debt, you have tremendous control over them. So you start to demand that in order to have a little bit of debt relief, they have to sell off their public utility companies or other public sector institutions to the private corporations. So it's an attempt to get more and more power into the hands of the private corporations. At the same time, they're very much bringing the middle class down, because it looked to them like the middle class was beginning to get a little too smart, understanding what was going on. And so bring the middle class down some, not too far, because you got to have them buying your goods and services, but scare them, put them deep into debt. When you're deep in debt, you don't rebel because you don't want to lose your house. You don't want to lose the food on your table to serve your family. So you basically become a eunuch. And they like that. That's what's going on today, Alex, around the world.
In closing, I've been asking the questions here. I'd like you to spend a few minutes on any topics or points that you think are really central to understanding the big picture here. And I'd also like you to look into your crystal ball, if you can, and describe where you see this going. We agree, giant awakening, new renaissance, enlightenment, whatever you want to call it, but the empire is going to strike back, to continue with the Star Wars analogy. So any other points that you think are important, and then again, elaborate on where you see things going.
Well, I think we have to all understand, each of us, that we have tremendous power, that these corporations only survive and thrive because we buy their goods and services. And we've sent this message to them that we want cheap T-shirts. And if that means being made by slaves in sweatshops in Indonesia, we'll just look the other way. We want cheap petroleum for our cars. If that means destroying rainforests, we'll just look the other way. We've got to now send a new message. We've got to tell these corporations that we expect them to serve the public interest, which is something they were mandated to do during the first 100 years that the United States was a country. That changed in the late 1800s when the Supreme Court had a turnaround. But we need to send this message out again, that these corporations are there to serve our interests, and we'll only buy from corporations that do that. And to recognize the power we have. We got rid of apartheid in South Africa when I was in college by boycotting corporations that supported it. We got them to open their doors wider to women and minorities and get rid of trans fats. We have tremendous power. The marketplace is democratic if we choose to make it such. I would like to suggest that probably the vote that we make each time we buy something or choose not to is more important than the vote we make every 2 years when we go to the polls. So we, the people, need to understand that we have to take responsibility here, and we can foment a revolution. We don't have to pick up guns. We just have to let these corporations know that we're only going to vote for the ones that are committed to making a better world for us, our children and grandchildren, those that are committed to being good public servants, to serving us.
Well, a microcosm of that is you couldn't find organic food 10, 15 years ago on most store shelves. Now it's displacing a lot of the garbage. Or you see examples of people not wanting bisphenol A lined plastic goods, and now it's being pulled out of many of the products. I mean, we see the examples of the fact that we do vote with our pocketbook. People should support alternative media, authors, TV shows, websites, and they should boycott the big corporate media when it engages in the type of propaganda it has. And I think what you're saying, John, in closing is look in the mirror. It's easy to make some judgment about a big corrupt Fortune 100 that we know is doing horrible things, but it's our empowerment, it's our buying its goods and going along with it that is literally basically buying war bonds to fund its operation. And so at the end of the day, we're being hypocrites when we sit here on a high horse criticizing these global corporatists because it really is us who've allowed this to happen.
Absolutely, Alex. Absolutely. I totally agree with you. And we also, we really need to insist that these corporations create a new economy. Right now, the economy of the United States is totally dependent on the military. I'm shocked by how people talk about balancing the budget, but there's no way we can balance the budget until we cut back the military budget, which is huge. And most of that just goes to creating things that get destroyed and destroy other people and make enemies for us around the world.
Well, now
they need to turn that around. There's so many opportunities. I speak a lot at MBA programs, and I encourage these young people coming up into the business world to form their own companies. We all know alternative energy is important, but what about creating new technologies for helping starving people in Africa grow food more efficiently, store it, and distribute it? Like you said, coming in the organic foods business has been a huge change in 10 years. What about creating companies that will clean up the terrible pollution that is all over our planet, in the earth, and the air, and the water? We really need to create a new economy that's not based on the military, and also not based on just selling each other trinkets, which we're also very good at, or selling each other derivatives and pieces of paper that lawyers and bankers trade around and don't create any jobs or help anybody in any way. We really need to take a good look at that. And you and I and all of your listeners are the people that can make that happen. We just have to become conscious and take positive action.
And we've got to watch out for counterfeits, because everything you've said makes total sense. We need to develop a new economy, not a war economy where we now see the military-industrial complex more and more taking over domestic operations, spying on the people. We have to realize this military-industrial complex does not serve our sovereignty or our liberty. It serves this global corporate system, and we pay for it. But then so many times in the IMF and World Bank, they'll use environmental excuses to put a new yoke of tyranny on the third world, instead of really trying to empower them. And it's a nuanced issue. John Perkins, I really appreciate you spending time with us. Just 1 minute on where you see this clash of ideas going, though.
Well, I'm very hopeful that we're going to win. We, the people, we're going to turn this thing around. And I see evidence of that in what's going on in South America. Huge revolution down there, democratic, market-based revolution. We're seeing it in the Middle East. We're seeing it in China. We're seeing it in Asia. We're seeing it in Europe. We're beginning to see it in the United States. I'm very hopeful. We don't know what ultimately will happen, but each one of us has to get involved and push harder for this. And that's how it will happen. So I don't know the outcome, but I'm very hopeful that we, the people, are rising to a new level of consciousness, and we will get there. And incidentally, Alex, I'd really encourage people to subscribe to my newsletter at johnperkins.org. Visit me on Facebook, Twitter, economic_hitman, and keep this conversation going, because I really like to talk with your audience on a continuing basis.
Absolutely. Well, this is the shorter format InfoWars Nightly News, but I would like to invite you to come back on the full radio show in the near future. But I know you're a very busy man. John Perkins, God bless you.
Thank you, Alex. I'd love to join you again. Keep up your good work.
You too, my friend. Well, that's it for tonight's edition of InfoWars Nightly News.